All right, Rabosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for Tafshin Pei Hey, our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilson Mishpacha Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shir and Droshos this year as a zechus for besuros tovos for all of Am Yisroel. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Silvie and Teri Czinn, in honor of the birth of their granddaughter Devorah Eliana Czinn, and in memory of Dr. Zinn's father, Bunim Tzvi Ben Chaim, Shmuel Robyn Korobkin, and the zechus for refuah of Rabin's cousin serving in the IDF, Benyamin Chaim Pesach ben Musha Chana, and in relation of the Yahrzeit of Rabin's mother, Pesa Mira Bas Chaim, Dr. Moshe and Gavant, in memory of Dr. Gavant's parents, Yakov Meir ben Moshe Leib, and Shayna Bas Abba, and Dr. Bezadi Yamina Sofer. And our week of learning sponsors, Judy Pazner, in memory of Shimshon Laser ben Moshe Zichron Lebracha, Chaim ben Eliyahu Cohen, and Daniel Yehuda ben Shimshon Laser Zichron Lebracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, those who need a refuah should have together with Kol Choli Yisrael, Kodesh Baruch Hu should bring our hostages home, the Shalom and Bikarov, and the Meir Hashem, our holy soldiers, should be successful. B'chol Maasei Yedehem. We'll say with that, let us begin. Today's daf in Meir Hashem is Kuf Mem Beis. Kuf Mem Beis. We are picking up on Kuf Mem Aleph Amud Beis, and we left off. Where did we leave off? Am I on the wrong daf? Sorry. Today's daf is Kuf Mem Gimel, 143. We are picking up in Meir Hashem on Kuf Mem Beis Amud Beis, and we left off Hahud Amarlin. Good, perfect. So 142b Hahud Amarlu Lidvisu. So it is. Thank you. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17 lines up from the bottom. Hud Amarlu Lidvisu. Nechasi libni dahavile minach. So a man says to his wife, I hereby leave my property to my children that I have from you. If you take a look at the Rashbam says it's about, 2, 4, 6, 8, about 10 lines up from the bottom. Nechasi libri dahavile minach. V'lo haise ishta mu'uberes. So the case over here is actually a different kind of case. The man is saying to his wife, I hereby convey my property to any children that I will have from you. Now, remember again, up until this point in time, we've been focusing on Mizaki L'Uber. Can you go ahead and convey ownership ultimately again to a fetus? So now at this point, Halacha L'Maisa, the Gemara says over here, we're talking about a situation where the wife is not yet pregnant. So not only is not an Uber, but now he's conveying it to a future pregnancy. So any children that I will have from you, I hereby convey my property to you. So what's the halacha? So I'll say, so first of all, just the Rashbam already points out that this can't work. This can't work. In other words, even if you hold that Mizaki L'Uber somehow works, that's because at least the Uber is present. To go ahead and be Mizaki to a pregnancy to an Uber that may or may not occur in the future, that will not work at all. So what happens? Okay, so the Gemara says, Asa Breidik Shisha. So he had another son, an older son. And his older son said, Amar le, Hahu Gabra, Maitav Yale. So the older son says, what about me? You're conveying this gift to my yet-to-be conceived sibling. What about me? So Amar le, Zil Kani Techad Mibra. So the father says, you're right, you know what? Go ahead and acquire alongside like one of my sons. So in other words, so the father said, look at the Rashbam, Zil kani kechad bra, yikne ke'echad min abanim ha'asidim lehivalim me'ishazu. You're right. The same way that I just bequeathed this property, I gifted this property to any children who will be born from my wife. So too again, you should inherit alongside of them as well. So now the Gemara says, okay, so what's the status of this gift? Sahanach vaday lo kana dakati lesnu. So obviously, the conveying property to the children that he will have from this woman is not going to work. Why? Because those children don't exist. Right? They're remember again, he's conveying property to children with whom his wife may conceive in the future, or to whom his wife will conceive in the future. So that's obviously not going to work because those children don't exist. Hi is cholak l'talid b'makom anya, Olasle cholek letalia b'makom banyo. The shaila is, what about this older son? What about this older son? Does this older son get some share in the gifted property or not? So Rabbi Abin, Rabbi Moshe, Rabbi Yirmiyah, the Amri is cholek l'tayv makom banyo. So this is interesting. So Rabbi Abin, so just to understand how we've transitioned over here. We've been focusing up until this point in time with gifting property to a fetus. Now, so again, we still have to come back in from today to the halacha l'maisa, not to whether or not that works. Now we've transitioned to a different kind of case where Reuven is married to Rachel, and Reuven conveys ownership to a future pregnancy that may occur, to a future fetus that may occur. Now, so it seems to be that everyone agrees that that's not going to work. That's not going to work. The shayla is, in this case over here, where Reuven did that to a future fetus, so Reuven has a different son, or an already existing son, and his son says, hey dad, what about me? To which Reuven says, you're right, you know what, you will go ahead and inherit alongside your future siblings. So while I understand that the gift doesn't work for the future siblings, does the gift work for Reuven? That's the lashon over here. The Gemara says, do we say that the present son, the Gemara is calling him a talia, right? Calling him a little lamb, a little sheep. Does the talia, does the present son inherit alongside the future children or not? So Rabbi Avo, Rabbi Chanina bar Papi, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, the Amri less chelik l'talia b'makom manya. So these are Rabbanim, Rabbi Avo, Rabbi Chanina bar Papi, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, all say that the present son, does not inherit alongside the future children. The same way that the future children get nothing because it's not a gift. So too again, the present son gets nothing as well. Amrle Rabbi Avo, Rabbi Yirmiyah. I'm sorry, I skipped the line. Rabbi Avin, Rabbi Moshe, Rabbi Yirmiyah, the Amri is cholek l'tayv makom banyo. So this first group of Rabbanim, Rabbi Avin, Rabbi Moshe, Rabbi Yirmiyah, they all hold that even though the gift does not work for the future fetus, but it does work for the present son. Rabbi Avo, Rabbi Chanina bar Papi, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, the Amri less cholek l'tayv makom banyo. These other Rabbanim, Rabbi Avo, Rabbi Chanina bar Papi, Rabbi Yitzchak, all hold that halacha l'maisa, the present son does not have a chelik with future fetuses. So Rabbi said in the Gemara, Rabbi Avo, Rabbi Yirmiyah, hilchas hakavason or hilchas hakavasaychu. So Rabbi Avo said to Rabbi Yirmiyah, so who does the halacha follow? Does it follow your group or my group? Amar Leib, pshita the hilchas hakavason. This is interesting. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said, of course, the halacha follows us. The halacha follows us. Why? The Gemara says, the kashishna minaychu, because we are older than you. So the halacha follows us because we're older, and apparently again older means you're wiser, right? And therefore again the halacha follows us. Amarle midi b'kashishusa talya milsa. So to which he responded, I don't understand. Is halacha decided based on who's older? So the Gemara says, b'tayva talma milsa. We know that age does not always equal wisdom. Sometimes age always comes with a certain amount of life wisdom, but it doesn't necessarily equal. It doesn't necessarily go ahead and automatically result in greater logic. So the Gemara says over here, this is not dependent on age. This is dependent on logic. V'tayma mai. And what is your reasoning? So he says, Zila Gavit Rabbi Abin, Das Svarte Nehile. So go to Rabbi Abin, because I explained my story to Rabbi Abin, top of Kuf Mem Gimel 143, V'karkish ba Reishei be Midrasha. And when I explained it to Rabbi Abin literally again shook his head in agreement with my logic. Okay, so Azal Gavei comes Rabbi Yirmiyah. Amarle. So Ilu Amarle Kani Kechamar. Mikani. So we'll say, now listen to this. Rabbi Avin explains it in the following way. If somebody were to say, I want to convey to you property, acquire it like a donkey. Say that lashon. Acquire this property like a donkey. Would that work? Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Kani kachamar mikana kimosha chamar lo kana kenhu lo kana. So we'll say, so for example, if I were to go over to Reuven and say, Reuven, acquire this field like a donkey. Now, what I'm saying over here is the same way that a donkey acquires, Reuven, you acquire also. Obviously, such a statement would be meaningless. Why? Because a donkey can't acquire. A donkey can't acquire. So the Rashbam says over here, Kimoshach amor lo kana, kenhu lo kana, hachanami kihechi de bonim ha'asidim lava ba'olam lo kanu, ihu nami no kana. So also Rabbi Avin essentially is saying is like this. Whenever you make a gift to someone, and in that gift, you link the recipient to someone or something else who is unable to acquire, that ruins the entire transaction. So now no one could acquire. So the same way, if I were to go ahead and say, Reuven, acquire this field like a donkey. So a donkey can't acquire. So because a donkey can't acquire, therefore what? Reuven can't acquire as well. So ultimately, again, if I say to Reuven, acquire whatever it is, this field, this object, like a donkey, so it doesn't work. There is no acquisition. At v'chamar. Now here's what's interesting. What happens if I say to Reuven, acquire this field, you and the donkey? So essentially, the way the transaction sounds like is, I'm conveying ownership of the field to Reuven and the donkey. At v'chamar. What happens in that case? Rav Nachman Amar Kana Mechzer. Rav Nachman says in that case, Reuven acquires 50% of the field. Now, again, just to be clear, the donkey doesn't acquire the other 50%, right? But Lamaisa, the transaction works to convey to Reuven. In other words, the way Rav Nachman understands that transaction is, I'm not actually conveying to Reuven, I'm not actually conveying to the donkey 50% of the field. What I'm doing is, the fact that I'm including someone else in the transaction indicates that halacha Lamaisa, Reuven's getting part of it. Reuven's getting part of it. So the Gemara says, fine, Reuven's getting kana mechza. Rav Hamnuna says, lo amar klum. Such a statement is absolutely meaningless. So I will say, so now remember, this case is a little bit more comparable to our case. Because remember what's happening in our case over here, right? Reuven is married to Rachel, and what happens? Reuven says to Rachel, any children I will have from you. I hereby gift the property, any children I will have from you. So we'll say, so let's go with what we know. Everyone agrees that what? The gift to the future fetus does not work. Everyone agrees that doesn't work. There's at least again, if you say mezakil uber works, okay, there's an uber. There is a recipient to be maknet to a future fetus. Absolutely, again, there's nothing there. The shayla then is, remember again, Reuven's other son, his older son, comes and says, "Hey, Dad, what about me?" So to which Reuven says, "You're right. You should acquire alongside your future siblings." So again, obviously, for the future fetus, the gift is not going to work. The shayla in question over here is, will it work for the already existing son? Can he share in that gift? So now the Gemara says over here as follows. If I convey property to Reuven and a donkey, right? Reuven, I hereby convey ownership of my field and give my field to you and my donkey. What is the halacha? So Rav Nachman says, Reuven gets 50%. It works. Rav Hamnuna says, statement is absolutely meaningless. And Rav Shesha Samar Kana Hakol. Rav Shesha says, Reuven acquires everything. Okay, so what's going on over here? So I'll say, interestingly enough, Rav Nachman and Rav Hamnuna, I understand. Right? Rav Nachman, who says the statement is meaningless, why? Because Rav Nachman will say, anytime you link someone with a recipient who is incapable, halachically incapable of acquiring, you ruin the entire transaction. So you include a donkey in here in the transaction, you include a future fetus, none of it is going to work. Rav Hamnuna, sorry, that's Rav Hamnuna, right? Rav Nachman, I understand, again, when you include a non-viable recipient, you're still giving the viable recipient 50%. But Rav Sheshes, who says that Reuven will acquire everything, what's the pshat? So Rav Sheshes Menamim. Rav Sheshes says, from where do I know this? This Sanya, we learned. Rabbi Yossi says, Ein lecha mar bikishos ela pnimi shebo. So what's interesting? Cucumbers. So apparently, again, when it comes to cucumbers, so the Gemara says that sometimes the inner part of the cucumber is sometimes bitter. So the Gemara says as follows. So therefore, leficha kishu torem mosef alachitzon shebo b'torem. So therefore, I will say when tithing cucumbers, you have to make sure to add on a little bit. Because remember again, the Gemara. Let me tell you the background to this. The background to this is the Gemara is saying is that when you take truma, you cannot take truma. You should not tithe min hara ala yafa. You should not set aside bad produce as truma for good produce. So therefore, again, when you're using these kishuim, these cucumbers, where there is some bitter parts of the item, you have to make sure to compensate that by adding on a little bit more of good from other items. So the Gemara says from other cucumbers. So the Gemara says amai, but why should that work? At v'chamarhu. Isn't that a case, ultimately, again, of at v'chamar? Now, I will say, so remember, this is actually very interesting. So what's at v'chamar? So I go over to Reuven, let's go back for just a second, let's tie this all together. I go over to Reuven, I say, Reuven, I'm hereby conveying you a gift of my property, you and the donkey. Again, so you and the donkey are the intended recipients. So remember again, now Reuven is a bona fide recipient, a valid recipient. Donkey is not. Donkey is not. So the shayla now becomes, what happens with that transaction? So remember again, this is a three-way machlokes. Rav says Reuven gets 50% of the gift. Rav Hamnuna says the statement is totally nonsensical and therefore does nothing. And Rav Sheshes says it works to convey everything to Reuven. Right, so that's our machlokes. Now the Gemara brings up this truma case. So in this truma case, when I set aside cucumbers, right, as truma for other cucumbers, here's the problem. Included in the truma, the cucumbers that I'm setting aside as truma, is a bad or spoiled or bitter part of the vegetable, right? It doesn't work, right, of the produce. So therefore, again, when I'm setting aside truma, essentially what I'm doing is I'm setting aside a good part of the produce together with the bad part of the produce. Now, the good part of the produce works as truma. The bad part of the produce doesn't work as truma. But yet again, halacha l'maisa, the designation works. What do you see from here? That when you designate, right, when you designate something, and part of it is valid, part of it is invalid, the invalid part does not invalidate the valid part, and it works. So too, again, Rav Sheshes will say, when I go ahead and I give property to Reuven and the donkey, essentially, again, the donkey, we just kind of ignore it. And we consider as if the entire gift has been gifted to Reuven. Incredible. To which the Gemara says, no, it's not a good proof. Shiny Hasan the Midaraisa Trom Al Yasi. That's actually not a good proof. I'll tell you why. As much as you're not supposed to go ahead and separate out bad produce as tithe for good produce, if you did it, it works. The Gemara says, so Rabbi Leib says, how do you know that if you designate bad produce as truma for good produce, that it works? That it works. In other words, we'll say, even though I should not go ahead and designate bad produce as truma for good produce, if you did it, it works. How do I know that? Shne'emar v'lo tisu alav chet barim chemes chal bo mimenu. The pasuk says you should not go ahead and literally bear any sin when you go ahead and you literally again lift up or designate the truma from it. V'meino kadosh. Now again, I will say, if designating bad produce doesn't work, nisiyus chet lama, then what sinful behavior is there? The fact that it says, don't engage in sinful behavior when you go ahead and you designate the truma, indicates, I shall say that what? It's sinful, but yet what? It's sinful, but it works. So the Gemara says, Mikan l'tor min hara yafa shet truma so truma. From here you see that when you designate bad produce on good produce, ultimately, again, the truma designation works. Therefore, I will say this is not a good proof. Amrali Rav Mordechai Rav Ashi. So I'll say, so just to point out over here, so we are left, so right, where did we start? We started with, Reuven is married to Rachel, and he says to Rachel, when you become pregnant in the future, right, Rachel's not pregnant, any future children you have, I hereby again gift this property to them. Okay? Then what happens? Reuven has an older son. We'll just call him Levi. They go, hey, Dad, what about me? Reuven says, you're right. You will also inherit or not inherit. You will be the recipient of property alongside your future siblings. So what do we know? We know the gift to a future fetus. What's the status? Meaningless. The shayla is, what about the gift to Reuven? Right? What about the gift to Levi? The present son, does that work? So also, the Gemara says, well, let's open this up. Because this sounds a lot like the case of when I convey property to Reuven and a chamor, Reuven and a donkey. So again, in this case over here, one good recipient and one invalid recipient. What happens to that transaction? And this is a three-way machlokes. Rav Nachman says, in that case, Reuven gets 50%. Rav Sheshes says, Rav Hamnuna says he gets nothing. And Rav Sheshes says he gets everything. So Rav Nachman and Rav Hamnuna, I understand. The Gemara is trying to figure out where Rav Sheshes gets his opinion from. Okay, so let's go weiter. So the Gemara says, Masiv Rav Avya to Yufta. So Rav Avya brought up what he felt was a refutation. Sorry, Amrli Rav Mordechai Rav Ashi. Masiv Rav Avya to Yufta. So Rav Mordechai said to Rav Ashi that Rav Avya himself brought a contradiction to this. What was his contradiction? Listen to this. Well, we actually have seen this case before. The Gemara says, listen to this. Ma'aseh b'chamish nashim u'bahen shtei achayos. Okay, here's the case. 5 women, 2 of them are sisters. So what happens? A guy comes along, we'll call him Reuven, And what happens? V'likeit echad kalkala shel te'inim. Now, again, just to give a little bit more context, so five women, 2 of them are sisters, and it happens to be a Shemitah year. Reuven comes along, and he collects a basket of figs from one of their fields. V'shalahen haisa. Now, let's say again, it was from one of the women's fields, but v'shal shiyas haisa, but it was Shemitah. So everything is hefker, obviously. So what happens? Va'amar, and now Reuven turns to the group and he says, Kulchan mikudashos li bekalkala zos. Okay, so this is an interesting case. Reuven turns to the group and he says, you are all hereby betrothed to me with this basket of figs. Okay? V'kibla achas mehen ayedei kulon, and one of the women accepted the basket as kiddushin on behalf of the entire group. So I say, so now, okay, what's going on over here? Right? So first of all, just interesting case. Remember, you could be makadishon with an item of value. So remember again, this item of value are the figs. Even though the figs, technically speaking, came from the field of one of the women, but because it's shmita, therefore it's hefker. So now Reuven is being makadish the group. So one of them is accepting on behalf of the entire group the basket of figs. We will say, what's the problem? The problem is included in this group are what? 2 sisters. 2 sisters. And of course, a man can't marry 2 sisters. So what's going on over here? Sanu Chacham, so the Gemara says, the Chacham said, Ein achayos mikudashos. So the Chacham said, okay, the truth is, obviously, it's not going to work for the sisters. Right? So the sisters cannot become betrothed to Reuven. So both sides, the Gemara says, the poem something interesting. So it sounds like over here that what? The kiddushin will work for everyone but the sisters. But the sisters. The Rashbam says over here, it's right, it's about 5 lines up before the lines get wide. Ein achayos mikudashos, the kiddushin she'en besuros lebia lo havu kiddushin klal va'afilu bechada minayhu. So ultimately, because this is kiddushin that cannot result in bia, and because it's kiddushin that can't result in bia, therefore it's not a proper kiddushin. So ein achayos mikudashos. So the Gemara says something interesting. So achayos hu de'ein mikudashos, hanachayos mikudashos. So what do you see from here? It's only the sisters who this doesn't work for, but for everyone else it does. So we'll say, what is this a case of? What is this a case of? The Gemara says, this is ata v'chamar, right? This is the case of you and the donkey, right? This is the case ultimately, again, where you're trying to create something, you're trying to create a new transactional reality, and one of the people is an able participant, and one is not. And yet, so this is ata v'chamar, you and donkey, and yet what do you see over here? It'll work for the other sister, or it'll work for the other women, not the sisters. Va'amai, at v'chamarhu. This is a case of at v'chamar. So we'll say again, at least according to some of the opinions, at v'chamar shouldn't work at all. Amar lei. So Rav Ashi said back to Rav Mordechai, Hainu dechazoi Rav Huna bar Avia b'chama. So this is incredible. So Rav Ashi said to Rav Mordechai, now I know why the other night I saw Rav Huna in my dream. So apparently, again, Rav Ashi said, last night I dreamt about Rav Huna. I didn't know why I dreamt about Rav Huna, and now I know why. It foreshadowed the fact that Rav Huna was going to come into the base medrash and go ahead and ask this question. Quite beautiful. I will say, by the way, such a profound idea. Can you imagine if you're on the level that you're dreaming about Rav Huna? Imagine that you're on the level of dreaming about Torah. What a profound level to be on. So the Gemara says, the Moshe Rav Avia to Yufta. The Moshe Rav Avia to Yufta. Lav miokimna. The Amar haruuya mikem lebia tiskadeshli. I will say, the way we set up this case is that when Reuven hands over the basket of figs, what does he say? He says, I hereby give this over to the group, to any of those who are able to engage in an intimate relationship should become mikudashos to me. So in other words, he doesn't just say, you're all mikudashos to me. Rather, what he says is essentially, any of you who could be married to me, see, this is kiddushin for you. So therefore, by definition, that excludes the sisters, because the sisters are not fit for marriage with Reuven. Okay, so therefore, I get a say, see, we thought, essentially, the Havamina was that this was like a case of where he's just handing the basket of figs over to the group. If that's the case, then this would be a similar case to Ata v'chamar. But now it turns out that that's not what he's saying, but rather, again, what this case is he's saying, all of you who are fit to be married to me should become mikudashos with this basket of figs, and by definition, that will exclude the sisters. Okay, beautiful. So the Gemara goes like, Ahuda amar la lidvisu nechasi lach o libnech. So a man who says, okay, so first of all, Before we go on, so it appears that halacha l'maisa, the way it works with these cases of ata v'chamar or at v'chamar is that we paskin like Rav Nachman, and that's going to be reinforced in the next Gemara over here. That ultimately, again, you acquire 50%. So in other words, whenever you are involved transactionally and you are tethered to someone who cannot acquire, so being tethered to someone who can't acquire does not fundamentally undermine the effectiveness of the transaction. It just means that part of the transaction is meaningless and part of it is meaningful. So if I convey a field to Ruvain and I say, Ruvain, I hereby convey ownership of this field to you and the donkey. So essentially what halacha says is, I'm conveying 50% to Ruvain. That's the way we interpret the transaction. I mean to give half to Ruvain. That's, in other words, even though, right, I mean to give half to Ruvain. So kind of plugging that back, when Ruvain says to Rachel, any future children you will conceive will have this property, and then Ruvain says, you know what, to his existing son, you inherit alongside your future siblings, even though the part for the future siblings is meaningless, the part for the existing son is meaningful. So in the case of Ata v'Chamar, halacha l'maisa, again, you acquire 50%. Okay, so Moshe, so now the Gemara here continues on that same theme. A man said to his wife, Lech ulibnech, I hereby convey my property to you and to your children. Okay, so again, so in this case, Reuven is married to Rachel. Reuven and Rachel have children, and what happens? He conveys the property to his wife and his children. So what is halach in this case? So Amar Yosef kansa mechza. So we'll say, so the wife acquires 50%. So in other words, in this case over here, remember, Reuven is conveying ownership of property to his wife and her children, but he's not assigning percentages. Right? So how do we go ahead and understand the case of conveyance of property without percentages? So Rav Yosef says, okay, 2 people, 50% each. 50% each. Rav Yosef says, where do I know this? Where do I know that if you convey ownership of property to 2 people and you don't assign percentages, that the default ultimately, again, is 50% for each party? The Gemara says, "Desanya Rabbi Omer v'haisali Aaron ulabanov." The pasuk says that ultimately, again, it will be for Aaron and his sons. Mechtzali Aaron umechtzal banos. Well, so interestingly enough, this is by the lechem apanim. Right? Again, remember, in the Beis Hamikdash, there was a shulchan on a table. On that table, there were racks, and the racks contained lechem apanim. We'll call it, like they say in English, the showbread, the unique bread that was baked in the Beis Hamikdash. There were 12 loaves. Now, the way it worked, if you take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment, the beautiful Rashbam, v'haisali Aaron, it's in the wide lines, about 5 lines in. V'haisali Aaron, b'lechem aponim ksiv. So it's talking about lechem aponim. So the Rashbam says, Aaron zeh kohen gadol, mechzal kohen gadol, mechzal mishmeres kohanim. So I'll say, interestingly enough, the way it worked with lechem aponim is the kohen gadol gets half, and the other half is divided up amongst the rest of the Kohanim. So what Rav Yosef points out over here is like this. We have a biblical precedent. See here, the Torah is speaking about Lechem Apanim. What does it say? V'haisel Aaron ulabanov. The Lechem Apanim will be for Aaron and his sons. Now, what doesn't the Torah say? What doesn't it say? The Torah doesn't tell us how many loaves Aaron gets and how many loaves the other Kohanim get. But yet we know what is the halacha. Aaron gets half and the other Kohanim get half. So here, Rav Yosef says this creates a biblical precedent. What's the precedent? That whenever you convey something over to 2 people, even though there are no assigned percentages, the default is 50% each. 50% each. Mechzali Aaron, mechzali Banav. Aaron gets half, and ultimately his sons get half. Amalei Abaye says, Bishlam Hasam Aaron Bar Chalukahu Lahachi Parat Lebei Rachman Lemishkal Palga. So listen to this. Rabbi says that's not a good proof. In the case of Aaron, right? Aaron is fit for this division. In other words, we'll say Aaron, besides being a Kohen Gadol, is also what? A Kohen. So because he's a Kohen, by definition, he has involvement, right? He has a piece of the Lechem Apanim. So therefore, the Torah could be highlighting over here this idea that not only does he get a portion, but he gets half. Isha lav bas yerushihi daya shetitol ke'echad min habanim. Right, but a woman ultimately again is not really a bar yerusha. Right, she doesn't get a portion in inheritance. And Josh doesn't get a portion in inheritance. So because she doesn't get a portion in inheritance, maybe we should say that when Reuven conveys property to his wife and his children, she should inherit no more than the rest of the children. In other words, divide the gift equally amongst all of the recipients. Why should Rachel automatically get 50%? She should just get a portion like everyone else. So the Gemara says, Ini, is that so? But a case like this actually happened in Narda. And what happened? And Shmuel gave the wife 50%. But Tveria, Rabbi Yochanan Palga, happened in Tveria, and Rabbi Yochanan gave the wife 50%. Visu, Kias Rabbi Yitzchak by Yosef Amar, Hahu Demei Kalila, the Shadu Debei Malka, Aabule Va'aisturuge. So listen to this. Furthermore, there was the following story. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef said that the king once imposed a Demei Kalila literally means a crown tax. The king wanted a new crown. What does the king do when he wants a new crown? He imposes a new tax. It's a good system, right? He imposed a new tax, and then what did he say? He said this tax has to be borne, it has to be divided by the Abule and the Istaruge. The Rashban points out over here, Abule are Ashirim, are rich people, and Istaruge it's Istartigi are the officers. It should be borne by both of them. And Nisivu Abuli Palga, Vistarugi Palga. Each of those groups gave 50%. So the Gemara says, so again, all of this is painting the same picture. That whenever you convey ownership of something to two groups, without assigned percentages, then by definition it is a 50-50 split. So too when the king went ahead and imposed the crown tax upon these two groups, the rich people and the officers, so the financial responsibility was split 50-50 amongst the two groups. Which Gemara says, by the way, it's not a good proof. The truth is, no. In fact, with the crown tax, it used to be originally, the king really only assigned it to the rich men. And the officers would just kind of help out of the goodness of their heart. The Yadda Malkadava Kamasaya Hashta, Yadda Malkadava Kamasaya, and the king found out that the officers were helping out the rich guys. So the Gemara says, Hashta Maid Kaksivi Abuli Vistaruge. So ultimately, Lememra, the Havi Palga Vahani Palga. After the king heard that the officers were helping out, so the king decided to officialize this, right, and write it in the document that both the rich people and the officers each have to give 50%. So therefore we have to kind of take that last case out. So what we're focusing on over here is this fascinating case. Reuven is married to Rachel, and Reuven decides to gift his property to Rachel. And what he does is, he decides to give his property to Rachel and his kids, or the kids that he has with her, or her kids. It doesn't really matter who the kids are. His kids, her kids, their kids, makes no difference. Point over here is he's gifting the property to his wife and the kids. So they're both the recipients. So interestingly enough, the Rav Yosef says, Rachel acquires 50%. So in other words, when you have two parties who are recipients of a gift and no stated percentages, the default is a 50-50 split. And again, Rav Yosef's precedent, or Rav Yosef's proof for that, Lechem Aponim. Torah says Lechem Aponim goes to Aaron and his sons, and we know that the Lechem Aponim split is 50% for the Kohen Gadol, 50% for the other Kohanim. That becomes the precedent. Maser Rabbi Zera says as follows, Hare alai mincha mea isaron. Supposed to listen to this case. A man goes ahead, right, Reuben says, I hereby take upon myself to bring a carbon mincha, 100 isaron, right? Isaron is a measurement. So that's a big carbon mincha, 100 isaron. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? So the havi b'shnei kelim. Now obviously, so it says, we're going to see, you can't bring a 100 isaron mincha in one utensil. Because again, the largest mincha that one is allowed to bring is 60 isaron. 60 isaron. So therefore, if you pledge a 100 isaron mincha, which you can, that's going to have to be divided up amongst two utensils. So the Gemara says, so how do you divide it up? Listen to this. Maybe shisha mikli echad, varba mikli echad. So what do? You bring 60 isaron in one kli and 40 isaron in a second kli. That's the halacha on the base. Ve'in hevi chamisha mikli echad, v'chamisha mikli echad yatsa. But if you did 50, right, 50 in two kelim, it works. Now both say, now what do you see from here? In heavy in, lechatchila, no. Now both says, what do you see from here? You see lechatchila, the split that the halacha demands is 60-40. So, but, okay, if you split it 50-50, it works. So one second, there's a contradiction to what we said before. We'll say, what did we just say before? What has Rabbi Yosef been espousing up until now? Whenever you have to make a split between two things, how do you make the split? In the absence of any defined percentages, how do you make the split? 50-50. So here, what do you see? You have to make a split in the 100 isaron. You have to do that because you cannot bring a 100 isaron mincha, and yet ultimately the way we're splitting it is how? 60-40. 60-40, but why? Why not split it 50-50? So the Gemara said, one second, but if you say that when you assign something to two things, in this case to two kalim, right, that whenever you have to divide something, the default split is always 50-50, then quite literally, why shouldn't I be able to bring two menachos, each one of 50 isaron for each kli? To which the Gemara says, no. Here's the difference. Hachi hashta hasam anan sahadi dahai gavra meikar lekarbon gadol kamachavin. I will say, here's the difference. When Reuven says that he wants to bring 100 isaron mincha, what does that show? What does that show? This guy wants to bring a big carbon mincha. He is bringing a big carbon mincha, 100 isaron. So therefore, again, his desire is to bring the biggest carbon possible. So I'll say, so why does he seem to bring it in two utensils? He knows that you can't bring a 100 isaron mincha in one utensil, but therefore, kama de afshar la'asuye maisinon. I will say, so this is actually interesting. So it's clear that he wants to bring a very big carbon mincha. So therefore, again, but he knows, so therefore he pledges 100 isaron. But what else does he know? He knows that you can't bring 100 isaron in one kli. So what's his desire? His desire is to bring the biggest mincha that he can bring. What's the biggest mincha you could bring in any one particular kli? 60 isaron. 60 isaron. So therefore, again, it makes sense that in one kli he's going to bring 60 isaron, and then he'll bring the residual, he'll bring the remainder in the other one, which is 40 isaron. Beautiful. Okay, so therefore, we tried to bring this as a contradiction to Rav Yosef, but it turns out that it's not a contradiction, it's really just a separate case. So what do we do? So Hilchasa, so we're going to say the Hilchasa Kavase de Rav Yosef Besada, Inyan, Umechza. And I will say the halacha follows Rav Yosef in these three areas, Sada, Inyan, and Mechza. What are these three cases? If you take a look at the Rashbam, a little bit to the left, right? Go to the left about 8 lines down. Sada, Peraka Shutfin, Gabeahu, Gavra de Zabin Ara Ametzer de Beinasha, V'tzlas Mili Kam Rav Yosef Hasan. So we'll say, so that was 3 halachas that had to do with inheritance law and the ability to an inheritance portion to get property that is already adjoining property you already own. Okay, we're not going to get into that now. So that's Sada. Inyan, Rashbam says over here, Perek Yesh Dochlin Kinyan Emasai Choser. Rav Yosef Amar Kolz Mansha Oskim Ba'osa Inyan V'Stras Kinyan. So we'll say, so the case of Inyan or Kinyan, as Rashbam says, is Rav Yosef is of the opinion that if you're engaging in a transaction, at what point in time are you permitted to still retract? Right? At what point in time can you renege? As long as you're still talking about the details, right? As long as you're still talking about the transaction, you're involved in the transaction, you could renege. And lastly, mechza. So we'll say mechza is our case. Mechza is our case. That's whenever you convey property to someone, and you're conveying ultimately again to two parties, the default division of the property is 50-50. So therefore, we'll say, circling all the way back, so if Reuven goes in and says to his wife, I am hereby conveying property, right? Property to you and our kids. So he's giving a gift to his wife and his kids. The split is 50-50. So even though again, we'll say, so I just want to be clear. What happens if Reuven says, I'm giving you a field, right? I'm giving you and the kids a field. 70% to you, 30% to the kids. What's that, halacha? Okay, so that's a 70-30 split because it's been articulated. It's in the absence of any specific articulated percentages, the default split is 50-50. Where does Rav Yosef get this from? Lechem Aponim. I read Lechem Aponim was this 50-50 split. Kohen Gadol getting half, and the other Kohanim getting half. So that's how you paskin. And I will say, kind of just to circle back a little bit, so to go back, and that's why again, in the case of At V'Chamar, right, so again, what's the split in At V'Chamar? a 50-50 split. Just the difference in that case is the chamor obviously doesn't acquire, but the appropriate recipient does. So again, whenever you have these two recipients there, by the way, it's not just two. It'd be the same thing with 3, 4, 5, 6. In other words, whenever you have recipients and you do not articulate percentages of division, then the default is an equal division amongst the able participants. Okay, beautiful. Gemara goes weiter. Hahu deshadar piski deshirai lebeise. So what's the interesting case over here? A guy, we'll call him Ruvain, sent pieces of silk to his family. Now, the Rashban says over here, psiki deshirai chatichos mi stam shalach lachalik lebnei beso. So Ruvain went ahead and sent pieces of silk to his family to divide up. Right, to divide up. So what happens? Amar Rabbi Ami haru'uyin lebanim lebanim, ru'uyin lebanos lebanos. Okay, so what's this? So bepashtos, these were garments, right? Silk garments. So whatever garments are good for the sons, go to the sons, or go to the males, right? And whichever ones are good for the females, go for the females. Now all of this is assuming that halach l'maisa he doesn't have a daughter-in-law. Aval, interestingly enough, Aval is lekalsa. If Reuven has a daughter-in-law, lekalse shada. This is very interesting. The assumption is that when he sends silk garments back to the house, it's not for his daughters, but rather, again, it's for his daughter-in-law. Now, what's the pshat with that? If you take a look at the Rashbam says, lekalse shada v'lo libnosav. So again, Reuven sends, so this is a similar case as we saw before. In other words, the connection over here is once again an ambiguous gift. Right? Reuven sends silk garments back to his family. So he doesn't identify what is for who. So again, Rabbi Ami says, whatever is proper for the sons goes to the sons. Whatever is proper for the daughters goes to the daughters. But it only goes to the daughters if what? If Reuven doesn't have a daughter-in-law. But if Reuven has a daughter-in-law, then all of the female silk garments go to the daughter-in-law. Now what's the pshat with that? The Rashbam says, Lakal se shadar, v'lo libnosav, v'dafka de insebe banse, she'eni mutalas alav. Now listen to this. The idea, so Hashem qualifies this. If there's a daughter-in-law, then the silk garments go to the daughter-in-law. Now this is presupposing that Reuven's daughters are married. If Reuven's daughters are married, then they are no longer his financial responsibility. So therefore the assumption is that he would be going ahead and giving the gift to his daughter-in-law and not his daughter, which is quite fascinating. However, if his daughters are not married, then of course the silk garments will go to his daughters and not his daughter-in-law. Okay, we'll say now next. Okay, that's one. We'll say so again. All of these are applications of the previous case. So in other words, if you look at this case, what's this case? Reuven is going ahead and he's sending a gift. Right, he's sending gifts back to his home, but he's not designating who the recipients are. So once again, if it's silk clothing, male silk clothing will go to the sons, female silk clothing will go to the daughters. But if there's a daughter-in-law, and all there is daughter-in-law and married daughters, then the assumption is he wants it to go to the daughter-in-law. Okay, another case. A man says, I hereby give over my property to my sons, plural. Habile bra ubarta. So we'll say, interestingly enough, but he only has a son and a daughter. Right? So Reuven says, I hereby convey my property over to my sons, but he doesn't have sons. He has one son and one daughter. So what's the halacha? Mi kari inshi lebara banai, ulasaluki lebarta meisr kasi, odimalo kari inshi lebara banai, ulamoshcha lebarta b'matana kasi. So let's say here, the shiloh over here. So how do you understand sons? Is it common for a person to call one son sons? In which case he's meaning to convey his property to his son and exclude his daughter? Or does a person call his children his sons? Even his daughter. In other words, I call them my sons. And therefore he's coming to include his daughter in this gift. Essentially, what I the shayla is the term banai a generic term for children, and includes sons and daughters, or no, bana is gender specific. It means a son. And therefore, again, aloha l'maisa, maybe just a person refers to his son even as sons, and therefore he's only coming to go ahead and include his son in the gift. A good shayla. So this is actually very interesting. So Amar Abaye says as follows: Tashma u'bnei Dan chushim. So let's look how the Torah writes. It says the children of Dan, plural, chushim, one son. What do you see from here? That even one son is called plural sons. Amar le Rava, Dilma Kiditana de Chizkiah. Well, Rava says, well, maybe there's an interpretation of that, which is Shahayu Merubin Kechushim Shalkana. So even though there was only one son, right? That one son, literally again, they were as multiple. Kechushim Shalkana literally means as the clusters of reeds. In other words, even though there was only one son, that one son birthed a very large family. Maybe that's why it's phrased that way. Amar Rava Ubenei Falu Eliav. Or we have other examples of this. The sons of Falu, so the sons Bnei, plural, Eliav, one. Rav Yosef Amar, Ubnei Esan Izaria. Right? The sons of Eitan were Azaria. So what do you see from here? From all these cases? From here you could see that even though sons, plural, could actually refer to what? Son, singular. And therefore, when a father goes ahead and Reuven gifts property to his sons, but he has a son and a daughter, it seems to be that the halacha says the property is going to the son and not the daughter. Now, it happens the halacha l'maisa. That's not generally how we paskin. It seems in general that the approach is that halacha l'maisa, when a person says children plural, even sons plural, and he only has a son and a daughter, b'pashtos, he means that daughter as well. But at least according to where the Gemara is holding, sounds like the Gemara is saying that you could call sons plural. Beautiful idea. Okay, let's say the Gemara says, let's say if you think about it, by the way, there's also, you quoted this pasuk yesterday, of Bunim Atem LaHashem Elokeichem, right? You are sons to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So what is the Gemara highlighting over here? So again, that's a beautiful pasuk that we are all considered to be the children of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What's the problem? Well, the beauty of it is we're children of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What's the problem? The problem is maybe we're all just part of a collective, right? We're all just part of a group. So what you see from this Gemara is Bunim can sometimes refer to the singular as well. Never think that just because you're part of the collective of sons to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that you're lost in the group, right? That there's anonymity, because sometimes even a collective identity, Bunim, could still refer to singular identity as well, right? Just like when Reuven gives his property to his sons, he's really just giving it to a son. So too, it's important in our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that even though we are part of a collective, but that being part of a collective never comes at the expense of the ability to forge a meaningful, beautiful, and individual relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu as well. Let's finish up the Gemara. So let's listen to this similar case. Reuven says, I hereby convey ownership of my property to my sons, plural. Now Reuven only had one son, but he also had a grandson. The Gemara says, Karu inshi lebar bra olo. Does a person call his grandson a son or not? Rav Chaviva Amar Karu inshi lebra bra. Mar bar Vashi Amri lo Karu inshi lebra bra. Machlokas. So Rav Chaviva says, yes, people call their grandchildren, their grandson, their son. And Mar bar Vashi says, no, people don't call their grandson their son. They call it their grandson. So there's a Tanya Kavasi de Mar bar Vashi. So there's a brisa that supports Mar bar Vashi. Hamudra hanami banim. Mutter bibnei banim. If a person makes a neder not to get benefit from his sons, he is permitted to get benefit from his grandsons. So what do you see from here? That a person does not call his grandson his son, and therefore halacha l'maisa in the case where Reuven gives property to his sons, even though he only has one son and a grandson, the property goes to his son and not his grandson. We'll say, shkoyach. A good Erev Shabbos, everyone. All right, Cheshvan Zoom, a good Erev Shabbos, everyone.